The hand closed on his collar while his daughter was still holding his other one, and that was the detail that decided everything about the next few seconds. Bruce did not pull away. He looked up at the big man in the leather jacket who had just gathered a fistful of his shirt, and then he looked once down at the small hand wrapped around two of his fingers, and then back up, and something in his face had gone very still and very quiet. The train swayed on. The country slid past the window in a green blur, and 5 men who had spent the last 20 minutes doing whatever they wanted in that car had just made the only real mistake of their afternoon. To understand how an ordinary train ride turned into 8 seconds nobody in that car would ever forget, you have to go back to the first station after lunch, when the 5 of them got on and the temperature of the whole carriage changed. They came aboard loud, the way men do when they have already decided the space belongs to them. There were 5, led by a heavy man in a brown leather jacket with a voice built to fill a room. They were known on that line, a small crew that worked the slow local trains through the poor country stops, riding a few stations, taking what they liked from people who could not fight back, and getting off before anyone official could be found, and doing it often enough that the regulars had simply folded it into the price of the ticket. The leader had run the crew for years on a single principle, which was that most people will give up almost anything rather than be hurt in front of strangers, and he had never once in all that time been proven wrong. They moved down the aisle of that slow rural train like tax collectors, because on this line at this hour that is more or less what they were. It was a local, half-empty, the kind of train that stops at every small town and carries people who cannot afford a faster way to travel, an old woman with bundles, a tired man in a cheap suit, a mother trying to keep a baby quiet, and near the middle of the car by the window, a man in a dark mandarin-collared shirt with a little girl in a red pinafore leaning against his arm. Stay with this, because the thing that made the next few minutes so dangerous was not the 5 men, it was the child, and the fact that there was nowhere on a moving train for her to go. The gang worked the car the way they always did. The leader would stop beside a passenger, say something friendly that was not friendly at all, and wait, and the passenger would hand over a wallet, a watch, a bag of groceries, whatever kept the man moving on down the aisle. They took the old woman's bundle and dropped it open on the floor to pour through it, and left it there. They took the tired man's envelope of cash and laughed at how thin it was. One of them leaned over the mother with the baby and said something that made her go white and clutch the child harder, and the men behind him grinned. Nobody resisted. On a train doing 60 through empty country, with the doors locked between cars and the next station 20 minutes off, there is no resisting, there is only getting through it. The conductor had locked himself in the forward vestibule 2 stops back. Everyone knew how this went. You looked at your knees and you waited for it to pass. The man by the window watched them come down the aisle, and he did the arithmetic every father does automatically. 5 of them, the tight aisle, the sway of the floor, the locked doors, and 18 inches to his right, the one thing in the world he would not risk under any circumstances. He shifted slightly, so that his body sat between the aisle and the girl. He murmured something to her, low, "Just look out the window, watch the horses, stay right here against me," and she nodded and went quiet and small, the way frightened children do when someone they trust tells them to. And he kept his hands loose and open on his knees, and he waited, and he hoped, the way everyone on that train hoped, that it would simply pass. He had spent a lifetime learning how to end things like this in a heartbeat. He had spent a longer time learning not to, if there was any other way, because a child should not have to watch her father become that. He was hoping, right up to the last second, that these men would let him keep hoping. It did not pass, because the leader was the kind of man who could smell the one person in a room who was not afraid of him, and it drew him like a splinter draws a thumb. He stopped beside their seat. He looked at the man in the dark shirt, and then deliberately at the little girl pressed against the window, and he smiled, and he let his eyes rest on the child, a beat too long, because frightening a man through his kid was a tool he had used before and enjoyed. "Nice girl," he said. "She should learn early how the world works. Empty your pockets and she'll get a good lesson in it." take what you want from me," the man said quietly. "I won't stop you, but you'll leave her out of it, and you'll leave these people alone for the rest of the ride." The whole car heard it, because it was the first time anyone had said anything but yes. Stay with this, because that one calm sentence spoken by a small man to a much larger one was the thing that turned a robbery into the mistake of these men's lives. The leader's smile changed. He was not used to conditions. He leaned down close, and the other four fanned in behind him, filling the aisle, cutting off the light, and one of them cracked his knuckles just to be heard doing it. "You don't give me terms," the leader said. "Not you, not anybody on this train," and he reached out and took a thick fistful of the man's collar and hauled him half up out of the seat, right there in front of the child, to make the lesson complete. The little girl made a small sound and grabbed her father's fingers tighter, and the man in the dark shirt looked down at that small hand and then up at the leader, and he said, in a voice so even it was almost gentle, "Not in front of my daughter." Then 8 seconds happened, and half the car never even understood they had occurred. He did not stand up into the grip. Standing was what the big man's braced arm was waiting for. He turned instead, hard, into the wrist that held him, rolling his shoulder over the top of the gripping arm, so that the leader's own locked elbow became a lever, and in a tight train aisle, there is nowhere for a big man to step out of a lever. The leader went off his feet and down between the seats before the grip could even tighten, his own weight and the sway of the car finishing what the turn had started. 1. The knuckle cracker lunged over the falling leader and met a flat palm that drove the air out of him and folded him back into the man behind. 2. That third man stumbled off balance, and the father was already up out of the seat now in the aisle, his body still angled between all of it and the girl, and he put an elbow into the third man's jaw as he came off the seat back, and the man simply sat down in the aisle and did not get up. 3. 4. The fourth swung a wild, heavy punch in the tight space, the kind that ends things in a bar, and there was no room to slip it, so the father did not slip it. He stepped inside it, caught the wrist, and used the swinging man's own momentum and the sway of the train to run him head down into the luggage rack with a sound the whole car felt. 5, 6. The fifth, the youngest, at the back of the aisle, looked at the 4 men down around him in the time it takes a train to cross a bridge, and put both his hands up, open, and backed away, and was never touched. 8 seconds from the collar to the stillness, and the loudest thing in the car was the rails clicking under the floor. An old man in a grey suit across the aisle, who had handed over his watch 10 minutes earlier, without a word, would tell the story in his village for the rest of his life, and he always told it the same way. "I looked down when the big one grabbed him," he'd say, "because I did not want to see a man beaten in front of his child. And when I looked up, the big ones were on the floor and the small one was sitting back down with the little girl, and I never saw the part between. Nobody in that car saw the part between. It was there and then it was done." The leader was the last to understand it. He got himself up onto his hands in the aisle, blood at the corner of his mouth, and turned to look at the man who had done this, expecting to find someone towering and terrible, and instead found the same slight passenger already back in his seat, one arm around his daughter, watching him with no anger in his face at all, which was somehow worse than anger. And it was the youngest of his own men, backed against the far end of the car with his hands still half raised, who said the thing that made the leader's stomach drop. "Boss," the kid said, very quietly, staring. I've seen him, in the magazines. That's Bruce Lee." The name traveled down the length of that car in a whisper, seat to seat, and something changed in the air of it, because now the old woman with the bundles and the man in the cheap suit and the mother with the baby all understood at once what they had just been sitting 3 feet away from, and what these 5 fools had walked into. The leader understood it too. He looked at the small man, and at the calm, and at the child, and every piece of it rearranged itself into a picture he could not argue with. "Doesn't matter who I am," Bruce said, before the man could speak. "It would have ended the same way. You put your hands on me in front of my daughter." He said it without heat, as a simple fact, the way you'd explain why a dropped glass broke. "Take your men and get off at the next stop." The leader did not answer. There was nothing to answer with. The train was already slowing, the first low buildings of a town sliding into the windows, the brakes beginning their long sigh, and he gathered what was left of his crew, the ones who could walk, helping the ones who could not. And he did not look at the other passengers, because he could feel every one of them looking at him now, and the fear that had filled that car 20 minutes ago had somehow, in 8 seconds, changed hands. When the train stopped, the 5 of them got off. Nobody made them. They simply went down onto a small country platform in a town none of them had meant to visit, and stood there looking oddly small in the sunlight as the train pulled away and left them behind. Inside the car, the old man in the grey suit leaned across the aisle, and the father passed him back his own watch. It had come loose in the scuffle and slid under a seat, and the old man tried to give it to the girl instead, for her father, and the father wouldn't have it. And there was a small, kind, gentle argument about a watch that the whole car pretended not to watch, and every person in it needed to see. The little girl was quiet for a long time after, the way children go quiet when something has been too big to hold, and then somewhere in the green country between towns, she looked up at him. "Baba," she said, "you told me to be still, but you weren't still." "I told you to be still because you were safe if you were still," he said. "There's a difference between the two of us today. You had someone to keep you safe." He smoothed the collar the big man had crushed, absently, and looked out at the fields going by. "The whole reason I could do what I did is that you did what I asked. If you had run into the aisle, I would have had to protect you instead of finishing it, and it would have gone worse for everyone. Being still was your part. You did it perfectly." She thought about that with the enormous seriousness of a small child, and then leaned her head back against his arm, and the fear went out of her the way weather passes, and by the next station she was asleep. He sat with his crushed collar and his daughter's weight against him, and watched the country roll by, and around him the car slowly filled again with ordinary sound, someone laughing, a baby fussing, the old man telling the story already to the person beside him, for the first of the 1,000 times he would tell it, and none of them, not even the man telling it, could ever quite describe the part in the middle. Only 5 men knew that part, and they were standing on a platform 2 stops back, watching the empty rails, learning the thing everyone on that train had learned in 8 seconds, that the most dangerous man in any room is almost never the one doing the shouting.